When I was in seminary, a Hebrew Bible professor of mine liked to tell the story from the 1970s of traveling with a group of her students down to Washington, D.C. to participate in protests against the U.S.'s bombing campaign in Cambodia. She and her group of students were a part of a sit-in down there when they were rounded up, arrested, put into wagons, and brought to a large warehouse-style facility where the Capitol Police were bringing protesters that they were detaining. She told us that while her students, herself, and dozens of other protesters were in holding, one of her students declared that this was a time to celebrate communion. No one had brought a chalice or a paten. No one had brought wine or bread. But she said that someone had produced a glass bottle of Coca-Cola. Someone else had a sleeve of Oreos, and she herself had brought a 2-pack of Twinkies. This is protest energy food. She was the ordained minister there, the religious authority in matters of holy consecration. She said that she didn't remember if she hesitated when her students put these things in front of her to be made into the host. She didn't remember if she asked herself a theological question about Twinkies and soda as the broken body and poured out blood. All she remembered was watching the people there in the holding cell sharing and passing communion to each other, bites of cookies and sips of soda. Another communion. The church where my grandfather was the senior minister is a very, very stately, classic church. Tall, white, steepled in the middle of town on a hill. The inside of the sanctuary is also just pure white with soaring ceilings and chandeliers. There's a big, wide center aisle that leads to a low chancel surrounded by railing. There's this large 20-foot cross backed in red on the wall above the altar. It's very, very grand. People who belonged to that church when my grandfather was the senior minister would joke with me or bemoan his certain particularities that he had regarding, well, everything, particularly communion. Everything was done with military precision. He was very specific. Communion servers were to wear dark gray or black suits, no brown, no light gray, no blue, even if it's navy. And yes, a suit means that your pants is the same color as your jacket. You must wear a traditional tie, no bow ties. And it was preferred that your tie be a solid color, but a simple pattern would be acceptable if its colors were not bright and ostentatious. You also had to provide and wear your own white fabric gloves, which I thought was a little odd because they were handling grape juice. I feel like that's setting up a bad situation. And then when it came to the actual serving of communion, it was also done with precision. You were trained that when you came down the aisle to receive the elements, to then pass it and distribute it into the congregation, you were trained on how to do a proper 90-degree turn, which is what you were to do every time you needed to turn. You walk, then your feet together. You make a 90-degree turn, your feet together, you pause, and then you walk. Every month, at the twice-weekly services, this would happen. This was how communion happened. Reverend Clark believed that the holy, sacred thing that occurs in communion needed to be demonstrated in our human exercising of it. A tale of two communions. The first occurred only once with Coca-Cola and Twinkies in a jail cell. And then the second occurred continuously with suits and gloves and 90-degree turns in a sanctuary. Were we in the Bible right now, I, as a Pharisee, would have posed these two communions to Jesus and now would say to him, "Teacher, of these two, to which communion table does God appear?" Perhaps some of you are wondering some version of that question. It is the natural question to ask, and we don't need to wait for a Pharisee to ask it because it is an important one that pushes through some of us to ask. And it is important because it deals with a critically important issue, and not simply to draw lines between what is right and what is wrong, between orthodoxy and Twinkies, but to engage intentionally in how we encounter our God through this sacrament. Communion, and it's a little odd to talk so much about communion on a Sunday when we are not celebrating it. Communion is bedrock to everything that the church is, and the theology that informs how we live out this faith in the world. When we take it together, we put ourselves and everyone who we are taking it with the disciples in the upper room. And we similarly link our lives together and bless the common journey we're on. It teaches us the lesson of the crucifixion, that through this faith, the elements of death, a broken body and poured out blood, that they can become the very substances from which new life, new hope, a new beginning can break through into our lives unencumbered. And that in this faith, there is no earthly weapon or power or threat or suffering or even death itself that can break the bonds of Christian kinship that link us together and to Christ and to our God. It's big stuff. It's worth talking about. It's worth debating over. It's similarly important to the kingdom of heaven that Jesus parabolizes over in this morning's passage. The kingdom of heaven that Matthew is alluding to is a state of being here on earth within the lifetimes of human beings, where the goodness and righteousness and power of God comes to reign in every human heart, and therefore comes to govern the function of human society. Do you understand what that means for us? The kingdom of heaven is not something that awaits us when our lives come to an end. The kingdom is a way of being that is achievable in our lives as we live them now, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. It's the unhardening of human hearts to the suffering and oppression of others. It's drawing in each breath with conviction and confidence that we are loved and accepted by our Creator, as is our neighbor. And to quote that Hebrew Bible professor from earlier, the kingdom of heaven is when the garden of history that has been watered with the blood of so many champions of justice and equality and peace, when that garden will finally burst into bloom forever. It's big stuff. It's worth talking about, worth debating over. And in the passage, when Jesus tackles this big stuff, when he answers this question, what is the kingdom of heaven? He starts that conversation, starts the debate by saying that it is like 6 things: a seed, some yeast, a hidden treasure, a pearl in the market, a fishing net, a homeowner. Each one, Jesus says, is the kingdom. And he explains himself too, which is very, very rare, so relish it when you find it in the scripture. The kingdom is the seed and the yeast because of how it grows over time. The kingdom is the treasure in the field and the pearl because of how many times it was passed over by untrained eyes until finally someone sees it and recognizes it for what it truly is. It is the fishing net because it is full to bursting. And it is the treasure that once found, nothing should stand in your way from claiming it. And it is the homeowner, the one who knows that among treasures, no one is greater than another. So then, what is the kingdom? And Jesus says, it is all of them. Equally, perfectly, simply so. And that what makes them the kingdom points to a truth that transcends their differences. As I mentioned in our words of welcome, this last Wednesday evening, we had our first in-person worship service since the second Sunday in March, which I think was the 8th of March. It was the first time. It was physically distant. There were about 16 of us. We all sat apart, wore our masks in the back parking lot. Mark brought his guitar, stood very far away from us, and played for us. We were celebrating communion at that service too, and asked all who came to bring their own elements for safety's sake. Now, I didn't have a loaf of bread, nor did I have the time to buy some or make some. So I stood there in my pantry trying to decide between sliced bread and hamburger buns. I decided on the hamburger bun because it looked more loafy in my hand, but it was also very apparently a hamburger bun. I had brought juice, but I gave that to Barbara to use at the communion table, which meant that I was left with just my orange travel mug filled with ice water. And that was how I celebrated communion on Wednesday. And I have to say that if after that night I had learned that from then on and for the rest of my life I would eat nothing but hamburger buns and drink ice water, I would have to give thanks to God. Because to finally be with some of you again, to worship with you, to pray with you, to read our Bible together, and then to share communion together. For the first time in so long, I don't know if I have ever been so filled by any meal. And I have to also admit that I did not hesitate. I did not ask myself a theological question when I ripped a hamburger bun in half, or when I slid open my travel mug and heard the ice clang forward against the lid when I drank. In the company of you, I just ate and drank. And though we were in a parking lot, I'm pretty sure that I found myself in the upper room. Over the last 5 months, our lives have been filled with situations such as these. Things that would have been one way were we together that are now very different in their form. And we ask ourselves the natural question, is it actually the same? A birthday party over Zoom, a graduation car parade, a retirement party conference call. Are they different? Absolutely. Are they the same? And again, back with Jesus and his parables. Each one, They are so different from each other. And Jesus admits that almost jokingly, with each new parable. In my mind, every time a new one starts, the smile grows a little bit, knowing how ridiculous this might sound. But when you read this passage, and when you live your lives, do not ask yourself, which of these is the kingdom? Do not ask yourself, is it the same? Do not say to yourself, it is so different, how could it be? Instead, take what you have. Take what you have discovered, what you might suspect is the kingdom of heaven, and ask yourself, does this grow above and beyond me? Is this more precious than I can explain? Does this stretch wide enough for all who would seek to enter in? And when I find myself in it, am I unable to deny the sacredness of others? If so, regardless of what it might look like, and regardless of how you hope it might be, regardless of how you wish it might be, if it is so, then you might just be having communion. You might just have the kingdom of heaven on your hands. Amen.